Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, for affording me the opportunity to make a statement. Mr. Speaker, I am pleased to report on the decisions made at the special meeting of Cabinet on 10th June 2020 that was convened to consider the 15th Situation Report of the Health Emergency Operating Center. Mr. Speaker, Cabinet noted and endorsed the Health Emergency Operations Center COVID-19 Situation Report, of which I will elaborate later. Cabinet decided that the Attorney General be instructed to draft a new immigration and passport prohibition of entry order 2020. Prohibition. Yes. Cabinet reinstated internal and external visitations based on a 24-hour notification at Her Majesty's Prison and elderly homes and other residential facilities subject to the use of protocols that are approved by the HEOC. Mr. Speaker, Cabinet exempted locally based flight crews from mandatory quarantine requirements, subject to the compliance with public health protocols. Cabinet approved the re-entry of vessels under the operation of Virgin Islanders belonger captains based on protocols to be developed by the HEOC and Cabinet. And Mr. Speaker, Cabinet issued guidance and protocols to be followed by all sports and recreation disciplines. The Minister of Sport would further elaborate. Mr. Speaker, HEOC, in its COVID-19 Situation Report, indicated that 95 additional swabs and tests were conducted at our fully operational COVID-19 lab facilities at the Dr. D. Orlando Smith Hospital since issuance of our report number 14, and again is thankful and pleased to report that no new cases of COVID-19 has been determined. In summary, Mr. Speaker, of the 212 persons tested in the British Virgin Islands, 204 were determined negative, while 8 were deemed positive. As previously reported, 7 cases have fully recovered, while 1 person succumbed to the COVID-19 virus. Mr. Speaker, as a result of its aggressive COVID-19 control measures, the territory prevented the escalation of COVID-19 transmission and has maintained a steady state of low level with no evidence of community transmission or active cases as at the 10th June 2020. Since the activation of Phase 1 of the Restricted Border Reopening Plan, attention has been focused on managing the risk of important cases while simultaneously augmenting the health system and monitoring the workplace preventative measures that were implemented for the businesses that reopened since the lifting of the 24-hour curfew. To date, Mr. Speaker, 681 registrations were submitted, with 362 verified by immigration and cleared for processing by environmental health. 62 of the registrants did not meet the requirements established for individuals to re-enter the territory during Phase 1 of the Restricted Border Reopening Plan. Of the 362 that has been cleared to re-enter under Phase 1, A quarter of the individuals have re-entered the territory during the 7-day period of 3rd to the 9th of June 2020. 83 more nationals, belongers, residents are expected to arrive in the territory by 13th June 2020, with 19 of those approved for government quarantine to date, primarily the students returning from the United Kingdom. Mr. Speaker, HEOC has flagged several issues related to the mandatory quarantine arrangements for persons who have been cleared to re-enter the territory since 2nd June 2020. One of these involved discrimination against and eviction of returning nationals who are subject to mandatory quarantine by landlords due to fears and stigma around COVID-19. A lot of communication would be required, Mr. Speaker, to dismiss most of these fears, as it is a preventative measure taken to save lives and livelihoods, and not an indication of the presence of the COVID-19 virus. Also cited is the need to limit the number of weekly arrivals based on the available private security complement and the room's availability in the government quarantine facilities. We have authorized over 350 rooms. We have secured up to 250 thus far, and others are being negotiated as we speak. It forms part of a question to be answered later. Mr. Speaker, also cited is the building of human resource capacity with the Ministry of Health and Social Development and the wider public service to fully operationalize the transition from the red alert, stamp it out phase to the orange alert, manage it phase of the Health Emergency Operating Center National Action Plan against COVID-19 pandemic. Mr. Speaker, all the works by this government, all the findings by the HEOC, all the protocols established must now be placed in context. There are those who, for reasons unknown only to them and a few of their seemingly intent on creating a narrative seeking to sow seeds of discontent and confusion in the country, in this territory. Mr. Speaker, it was conceded very early that if our efforts resulted in minimum deaths and acute cases, the propaganda will be centered on how our actions affect livelihoods. On how our actions affect livelihoods. And if there were not an aggressive, proactive approach to COVID-19 by this government, and if our inactions had resulted in numerous deaths and acute cases, then the propaganda would have been centered on how our inactions had caused lives. We chose the former. The debate throughout the world is now centered on the balance of lives and livelihoods. The narratives must not be controlled by those merely seeking to sow seeds of discontent while offering very little substance to the solutions. The BVI deserves a complete look and narrative for consideration, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development is a group of 34 member countries that discuss the developed economic and social policies of the world. OECD members are democratic countries that support free market economies. In June 2020, the June 2020 report of OECD was entitled "The World Economy on a Tight Rope." Mr. Speaker, please allow me to cite excerpts from the report, which states that the COVID-19 pandemic is a global health crisis without precedent in living memory. It has triggered the most severe economic recession in nearly a century and is causing enormous damage to people's health, jobs, and well-being. The outlook focuses on two equally probable scenarios, one of which a second wave of infections with renewed lockdowns. Let me start that one over. The outlook focuses on two equally probable scenarios, one in which a second wave of infections with renewed lockdowns hits before the end of 2020, and one in which another major breakout is avoided. The lockdown measures, Mr. Speaker, brought in by most governments have succeeded in slowing the virus or the spread of the virus and in reducing the death toll. They have also frozen business activities in many sectors, widening the inequality, disrupted education, and undermined confidence in the future. As restrictions begin to ease, the path to economic recovery remains highly uncertain and vulnerable to a second wave of infections. Mr. Speaker, it is cited in the report that with or without a second outbreak, the consequences will be severe and long-lasting. The economic impact of strict and relatively lengthy lockdowns in Europe will be particularly harsh. Emerging economies face the challenge of strained health systems, adding to difficulties caused by a collapse in commodity prices. Many countries, Mr. Speaker, have introduced support measures to protect jobs in the near term in hard-hit sectors, but young workers in particular are vulnerable. Mr. Speaker, first, second, and third world countries are encouraged to invest in healthcare, support transitions, and plan recoveries. In the investment in healthcare, they are asked to strengthen healthcare systems and build a supply of medical equipment. Use the test, track, trace, and isolate and distancing strategies to limit virus outbreaks. Ensure global cooperation to develop and distribute a vaccine and treatments. This has caused debate as to world orders and to control of population, but it is cited. In the support of the transition, it is encouraged to help people and businesses in hard-hit sectors move into new activities, strengthen income protection. It's also encouraged to facilitate rapid firm restructuring and accelerate digitalization, and under that code of transition, to maintain liquidity support and be prepared for renewed financial turmoil. In the phase of planned recovery, it is asked that nations build more resilient supply chains with larger stocks and more diversification of sources. Keep interest rates low and ensure public spending and taxation policies support economic activity. And finally, to invest in public finances for people's well-being focused on fairness. Mr. Speaker, the report cites that strong fiscal support is warranted, but it has consequences. Public spending should be well targeted to support the most vulnerable and provide the investments needed for a sustainable recovery. The OECD and emerging economies face recession and uncertainty. It is a fact. It's reported. The global economy is now experiencing the deepest recession since the Great Depression of the 1930s, with GDP declines of more than 20% and a surge in unemployment in many countries. Even in countries where containment measures have been relatively light, early data has already making it clear that the economic and social cost of the pandemic will be large. Growth prospects depend on many factors, including how COVID-19 evolves, the duration of any shutdowns, the impact of activity, and the implementation of fiscal and monetary policy support. Uncertainty will likely prevail for an extended period. Given this uncertainty, two scenarios have been developed to reflect the possible evolution of the global economy. Mr. Speaker, I found it critical to look at two of the 34 or more OECD countries. Two. In the United Kingdom, the COVID-19 crisis has led to a severe economic contraction. GDP is projected to fall by 14% in 2020 if there is a second virus outbreak later in the year. An equally likely hit scenario would still see GDP fall sharply by 11.5%. In the double hit scenario, I think I'm pronouncing that incorrect, but it is. The unemployment rate is set to more than double to 10% and remain elevated throughout 2021 despite widespread use of furloughs. Measures to limit the effects of the crisis in that scenario would push the fiscal deficit up to at least 14% of GDP in 2020. The United Kingdom government swiftly put in place a comprehensive economic package. Fiscal measures include income support for workers and self-employed, around £330 billion in state loan guarantees to keep firms in business, tax deferrals, and an improved dispute resolution mechanism as an alternative to bankruptcy. Moving forward, these measures must be kept in place as long as they are needed, and fiscal policy should remain supportive. Higher unemployment benefits should be extended beyond the fiscal year 2020-2021 to help support demand during the recovery. Mr. Speaker, given the economic disruption caused by COVID-19, a temporary extension of existing trade relationship with the EU beyond the end of 2020 would help reduce the uncertainty. Public investment supporting the recovery should underpin progress in digitalization, sustainability, and inclusiveness. The second of the 34 or more OECD countries states that in the United States of America, the COVID-19 outbreak has brought the longest economic expansion on record to a jolting halt. GDP contracted by 5% in the first quarter at an annualized rate, and the unemployment rate has risen precipitously. If there is another virus outbreak later in the year, GDP is expected to fall by over 8% in 2020. If, on the other hand, the virus outbreak subsides by the summer and further lockdowns are avoided, the impact of annual growth is estimated to be a percentage point loss. The unemployment rate will remain elevated after states lifted their shelter-in-place orders. Mr. Speaker, massive monetary and fiscal responses have shielded households and businesses, but more will be needed to reduce lingering effects as a large number of bankruptcies and labor market exits. Complementary payment to augment unemployment insurance should continue, while the tax burdens of households and businesses should be lowered when they are directly affected by the lockdown. Additional support will be needed to help workers return to work. Some states and local governments will face financial difficulties as their main revenue sources have dried up and the debt burden will need to be addressed. Importantly, well-designed public finance support for developing a vaccine and treatment of COVID-19 could help to prevent a reoccurrence of a pandemic after leading to deaths and debilitating the economy. Mr. Speaker, I presented excerpts of the OECD report because, save for the scale, the BVI is a part of the world economy and is not immune from the effects of COVID-19. These two countries of which I speak, Mr. Speaker, are of importance, as so are others, to the development of the British Virgin Islands. In consideration of our economic stabilization response to the COVID-19 pandemic, we are forced to take into consideration the consequences of funding recoveries for pandemics and natural catastrophes. I may start that over. In consideration of our economic stabilization response to the COVID-19 pandemic, and for consistency, Mr. Speaker, if I can start from the very beginning, because it would have been interrupted based, in terms of the flow, based on the early interventions, which I welcomed. Mr. Speaker, I presented excerpts of the OECD reports because, save for the scale, the BVI is a part of the world economy and is not immune from the effects of COVID-19. The two countries of which I speak are of grave importance to the economy of the Virgin Islands. In consideration of our economic stabilization response to the COVID-19 pandemic, we are forced to take into consideration, A, the consequences of funding recoveries from pandemic and natural catastrophic events by loans and from the reserves mandated in the protocols for effective financial management document. B, the consequences of Brexit and its effects on our relationship with the European community. C, the pressures from OECD for open registries. And D, the consequences of the requirements for economic substance. Mr. Speaker, the Premier has presented the second of comprehensive plans which are indeed funded. The sources are being debated. But, Mr. Speaker, all of the considerations form part of what these plans must take into consideration. Mr. Speaker, we have a territory to build and a destiny to protect. Our people have fought long, and our people have fought hard. We must not fail them. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.